Let's be honest. When people talk about the Middle Ages, they imagine knights with shiny armor, big castles, and dramatic battles. Nobody talks about ledgers. And yet, behind every fancy sword fight, there was someone, somewhere, writing down how many sheep you owned. Strange, right? But here's the thing. Kingdoms don't run on courage alone. They run on coins, and sheep, and grain. And to keep track of all that, you need something much less exciting than a sword. You need a book. A ledger. Picture it. A wooden table in a dim stone room. A man with ink-stained fingers leans over a piece of parchment. There's a candle burning low, making a tiny pool of golden light. Outside, the world might be loud. Horses, wind, maybe a bell ringing. But here, inside this little office, the only sound is the quiet scratch of a quill. That's where history starts to get boring, but also kind of magical, because this is where tax records are born. Back then, life wasn't organized the way we know it today. There were no printed forms, no calculators, no spreadsheets. There were just people with good memory, decent handwriting, and a lot of patience. And kings quickly learned something very simple. If you don't know who owes you money, you'll never get it. So they started keeping lists. At first, these lists were short. Maybe the king wanted to know how much land he had, or how many farmers worked it, or how many barrels of grain they produced. Just the basics. But kingdoms grow, and when kingdoms grow, so does the paperwork. Soon, it wasn't just a list, it was a ledger. A big, heavy, boring book full of numbers, names, sheep, and grain. The earliest ledgers were simple, but they were powerful. If your name was on that list, the king knew you existed. If your farm was on that list, he knew how much he could take from it. Think of it like an ancient version of a tax return, except no refunds. And it wasn't just kings doing this. Local lords, bishops, abbots, anyone with a bit of land and a bit of power, they all kept their own ledgers. Everyone wanted their piece of the pie, or more likely, their piece of your barley harvest. The process of making a ledger was slow. First, they had to count. And counting wasn't just a quick glance. People would travel from village to village, walking through fields, peeking into barns, asking questions like, "How many chickens do you have? How much wheat did you grow?" And probably, "No, really, how many chickens? Be honest." Then the scribes wrote it down carefully with a quill on parchment. Not paper, real parchment, made from animal skin. Expensive stuff, which meant no scribbling or wasting space. Every line mattered. And if you've ever tried to write with a quill, you know it's not exactly smooth. It's scratchy. The ink blots, sometimes it smudges, sometimes it just refuses to cooperate. And yet, these people spent hours and hours doing it, slowly, patiently, one sheep at a time. It's kind of funny, actually. While the world outside was busy with wars and invasions and plagues, someone was in a small room writing, "Thomas, 2 cows. William, 5 sacks of barley. Margaret, 1 goat that keeps escaping." This quiet work didn't make big headlines, or any headlines really, but it built the skeleton of the kingdom. Because every king, no matter how powerful, needed 2 things. Who do I rule? And how much do they owe me? And here's a weird little fact. Early tax ledgers didn't just list what you owned. They could also list what you didn't own. For example, if your harvest failed, the record might say, "No grain this year," which sounds sad, but it actually protected some people from paying what they didn't have. So in a way, these dusty old books weren't just tools for taking money. They were also proof of your struggle, a strange little lifeline in ink and parchment. The people who made these ledgers were not heroes or villains. They were clerks, scribes, or sometimes just anyone who could write without making too big of a mess. They didn't get statues. They didn't get songs. Nobody told bedtime stories about Thomas the Great Accountant. But they had power, quiet power. Their ink decided what the king collected. Their handwriting could mean the difference between keeping your cow or losing it. And for something so boring, that's a lot of responsibility. The first ledgers were also surprisingly personal. They weren't written for the public. They were written for the ruler, which means they often had little notes in the margin, like, "The old mill by the river is broken," or "John refuses to pay again." Imagine centuries later, a historian reading that and thinking, wow, John really had tax issues. These small scribbles give us a peek into lives that would have been forgotten. The ledgers became little time machines, not very exciting ones, but very real. If we could travel back to one of those little record rooms, it wouldn't feel grand. No royal fanfare, just dust, candles, quills, and very tired people doing math in their heads. Someone probably sneezing, because parchment isn't exactly hypoallergenic. But this slow, quiet work mattered more than anyone back then could imagine. These ledgers helped kings plan wars. They helped build roads. They helped control everything from food prices to peasant rebellions. Without these boring books, medieval kingdoms might have fallen apart much faster. What's also interesting is that ledgers were a sign of control. If a king could keep a record of what you owned, it meant he was watching. Maybe not directly, but enough to send someone knocking when taxes were due. And everyone hated that knock. Nobody liked the tax collector. Not then, not now. But they couldn't argue with the ledger. The ledger had your name and a goat count. Of course, not everyone got recorded. Some small villages were off the radar. Some people didn't own enough to matter. But over time, as kingdoms expanded, they got better at finding, well, everyone. The net got tighter. The ledgers grew thicker. And what started as a small list on parchment became a giant, ongoing record of almost every coin, cow, and crop in the land. And that, right there, is why this dull part of history matters so much. It's quiet power. It doesn't ride a horse or swing a sword. It sits on a desk and writes, but it shapes the way kingdoms live and die. If someone had burned all those early ledgers, rulers would have been blind. They wouldn't know who to tax. They wouldn't know how much to expect. And kingdoms don't last long in the dark. So yeah, chapter 1 of this story doesn't come with dragons or dramatic music. It comes with a dusty book, a bad ink stain, and a tired scribe yawning into the candlelight. But that's the foundation of everything that came after. In the beginning, there was a ledger. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful in its own boring way. If kingdoms were built on ledgers, then scribes were the quiet builders. They didn't wear crowns, they didn't lead armies.
While kings sat on thrones, scribes sat at desks. And in the soft glow of a flickering candle, their world was made of parchment, quills, and numbers that no one else really cared to memorize. The medieval scribe was a strange sort of hero, a silent one. No songs were sung about him. No statues were built in his honor. But without scribes, there would be no records, no taxes. And without taxes, well, let's just say castles don't pay for themselves. If you walked into a medieval scribal room, you'd probably think you had entered the world's most boring classroom. There'd be wooden desks, low light, the faint smell of candle wax and wet ink, and people hunched over parchment like their backs had forgotten how to be straight. The first thing you'd notice? Silence. The kind of silence that almost hums in your ears. No chatter, no background music, just the slow scratch of quills moving across parchment. If you've never heard that sound, imagine someone very gently scratching their fingernail against paper for hours. That's the music of their world. Scribes had to be patient people, unreasonably patient. Writing was slow. Ink didn't dry fast. And if they made a mistake, They couldn't just hit backspace. They had to carefully scrape the ink off with a little knife, or worse, start over completely. Imagine copying down 3 pages of taxes, and then someone spills ink all over the place. That's not a bad day at the office, that's a full emotional meltdown. And yet, they did it, day after day, because someone had to keep the kingdom's books in order. Being a scribe wasn't a glamorous job, but it was respected. Most scribes could read and write, which already put them ahead of a big chunk of the population. In some villages, scribes were the only people who could actually read. That made them valuable. They worked for lords, bishops, abbots, sheriffs, and sometimes for kings themselves. But don't imagine royal treatment. Most of them spent their days in cold little rooms with drafty walls, trying not to let their ink freeze in winter. And oh, that ink! It wasn't the smooth, flowing kind we use today. It was thick and stubborn, made from things like oak galls, soot, and iron salts. It stained everything it touched. Hands, clothes, tables, probably their souls too. Their main tool, the quill, came from geese feathers. They had to sharpen it themselves to get the tip just right. A scribe with a bad quill was basically a painter with a broken brush. And parchment wasn't cheap either. It was made from animal skin, usually sheep, sometimes goats or calves. So every time they wrote, they were literally writing on what used to be somebody's dinner. No pressure, right? Scribes also had to be neat. Kings didn't like messy ledgers. Lords didn't want to guess whether that number was 10 or 100. One smudge could mean the difference between a fair tax and a royal tantrum. Many scribes developed their own handwriting styles, some neat and tiny, others a bit chaotic, like the handwriting of someone who's had too much mead. If you ever look at surviving medieval tax records, you'll see all kinds of weird little flourishes, loops, curls, fancy tails on letters. That was their personal touch, a quiet rebellion in a world ruled by numbers. But here's the fun part. Scribes didn't just write down taxes. They sometimes left secret notes, little messages in the margins like, "My hand is tired," or "I'm so bored," or even, "I hope God forgives whoever made me copy this." We know this because historians have found those exact kinds of scribbles in old manuscripts. Imagine someone 800 years ago sighing into their parchment, and centuries later, someone reading their complaint and laughing. It's kind of comforting to know that workplace boredom is timeless. The scribal world also had its own hierarchy. There were the junior scribes, the newbies, who probably got stuck copying the boring lists. Then the more experienced ones, who got to write the official stuff with fancy ink and seals. And finally, the head scribe, the boss of the ink dungeon. If something went wrong in the records, like a missing sheep or a tax number that didn't add up, everyone looked at the head scribe. Poor guy probably had more stress than the tax collectors themselves. Many scribes were trained in monasteries. Monks were some of the most skilled record keepers of the age. They spent their lives writing everything: prayers, laws, taxes, sometimes recipes. Yes, even medieval monks liked food. This meant a lot of tax ledgers were written in Latin, the language of official business. And if you didn't speak Latin, too bad. You still had to pay. For the scribes, Latin wasn't a mystery. It was their everyday work language. But that also gave them a strange kind of power. If you control the pen and the language no one else understands, you control a lot. Their daily routine didn't change much. Wake up, wash, maybe pray, sit at the desk, dip the quill into ink, write for hours, stretch their hands, maybe mutter a curse at the parchment, write some more. And on some days, when a tax collector came back from the countryside with a pile of new information, the scribes would groan, because that meant another long night, another 100 names, another 100 chickens, sheep, goats, and sacks of grain to list. The scribal world was slow and quiet and honestly kind of dull. But in that stillness, something powerful was happening. They were building the paperwork that held kingdoms together. Kings could fight wars and throw feasts, but it was the scribes who turned the chaos into neat lines of ink. They made sense of numbers so rulers could make plans. They turned messy reality into a tidy, royal-approved version of it. And they also had one more job: guarding the records. A ledger wasn't just a piece of parchment, it was proof. Proof of who owed what, who owned what, who mattered to the king. So these books were often kept in locked rooms or chests, protected like treasure. Because in a way, they were treasure. Not gold, but something even more valuable to a ruler: information. And who had the keys to that treasure? The scribes. The funny thing is, most of their names are lost. We remember kings and lords, but the people who actually wrote down the history? Forgotten. And yet their handwriting lives on. Those faded, squiggly letters are still here. Centuries later, they're still whispering from the parchment. Hey, I was here. I wrote this down. So the next time you think of the Middle Ages, try to picture this: a small, chilly room, a hunched figure by the candlelight, ink stains on the fingers, a long sigh, and a quiet world where empires are built not by swords, but by scribes. They didn't get the glory, but without them, there would be no ledger, and without the ledger, no kingdom. The scribal world was slow, dusty, and dull, but it was also the silent heartbeat of medieval power. Let's take a quiet little trip back to England. The year is 1086. The king is William the Conqueror. Yes, the same guy who crossed the English Channel, defeated Harold at Hastings, and basically changed English history forever. But right now, he's not holding a sword. He's holding, well, okay, not exactly holding it, more like ordering it to be made. It's called the Doomsday Book, and it's probably the most famous tax record in medieval Europe.
William was a conqueror, but he was also a planner. He didn't just want to sit on the throne and look scary. He wanted to know what he ruled. Who owned what? How much land was out there? How many cows, pigs, sheep, mills, fields, houses, and chickens existed in his brand new kingdom? Because let's face it, conquering a land is one thing. Running it, that's where the paperwork starts. So William did something no English king had done before. He ordered a massive, kingdom-wide survey, a giant inventory, basically the medieval version of a national spreadsheet. Now, imagine England in the 11th century. No phones, no maps like we have today, no Google Earth, just muddy roads, horse travel, and people who didn't like strangers asking about their chickens. And yet, the king's men went everywhere, village to village, farm to farm, knocking on doors or sometimes just standing in fields asking questions like, how much land do you have? How many oxen? How much do you make in rent? And please don't lie. The king really hates that. These people weren't just taking a friendly survey. They were collecting the information that would feed directly into William's tax system. Because let's face it, conquering a land is one thing. Running it, that's where the paperwork starts. So William did something no English king had done before. He ordered a massive, kingdom-wide survey, a giant inventory, basically the medieval version of a national spreadsheet. Now imagine England in the 11th century. No phones, no maps like we have today, no Google Earth, just muddy roads, horse travel, and people who didn't like strangers asking about their chickens. And yet, the king's men went everywhere, village to village, farm to farm, knocking on doors or sometimes just standing in fields asking questions like, how much land do you have? How many oxen? How much do you make in rent? And please don't lie. The king really hates that. These people weren't just taking a friendly survey. They were collecting the information that would feed directly into William's tax system. Because when the king knows exactly what you own, well,
he knows exactly how much he can take. The name Doomsday Book didn't come right away. Back then, it was simply known as the Great Survey. But over time, people started calling it Doomsday, as in Doomsday, because once something was written in it, there was no arguing. If the book said you owed 5 cows, then congratulations, you owed 5 cows. End of discussion. No refunds, no appeals. It was like the medieval version of a final exam grade, permanent, unchangeable, brutal. The making of the Doomsday Book was a huge job. William sent out royal commissioners, basically his trusted officials, to collect the information. These commissioners would gather local juries, usually made of landowners and villagers, and question them. They didn't just ask about who owned the land now, they asked who owned it before the Norman conquest, and before that. They compared numbers, checked claims. It was part tax audit, part detective work, and part royal intimidation. All this information was then brought back and handed over to scribes, those same ink-stained heroes from Chapter 2, who compiled it into 2 massive volumes. And here's where it gets funny. Even though the book sounds huge, it didn't actually list everyone. It mostly focused on landholders and taxpayers, the people who mattered to the king's finances. If you were a peasant with nothing but a rusty hoe and a bad back, congratulations, you probably didn't make it into the Doomsday Book. But your landlord did, and if he paid, well, you paid too, one way or another. The details in the Doomsday Book are surprisingly specific. It lists who owned land, how much they had, what it was worth, how many animals they owned, and even how many people worked the land. You'll find lines like, Robert holds 3 hides of land. There is land for 4 plows. There are 12 villagers and 3 slaves. There is a mill and meadow for 2 oxen. It's not exactly bedtime poetry, but it's an accountant's dream. And just like any big government project, it wasn't perfect. There were mistakes. Some places were missed. Some people probably lied. Some officials probably took a nap when they shouldn't have. But for the 11th century, it was mind-blowingly organized. This was one of the most detailed records ever made in medieval Europe. It gave William the power to see, on parchment, how wealthy his new kingdom was, how much land could be taxed, how much grain could be stored, how many soldiers could be raised. And that was power. Now, let's take a second to imagine what this book actually looked like. It wasn't a small notebook. It was a massive, leather-bound volume written on parchment. The handwriting was tight, neat, and Latin, of course, because Latin was the official language of "we mean business." The ink was black and brown. The letters curled in elegant medieval style. If you opened it, it wouldn't look magical or royal. It would look boring. Just line after line of names and numbers. But don't let the dullness fool you. That book was the kingdom's brain. There's a little detail many people don't know. The Doomsday Book wasn't made to impress anyone. It wasn't even really meant for the public. It was made for the king. A tool for control. A weapon made of ink instead of steel. And it worked. With this book, William could collect taxes more efficiently than any English king before him. He could keep the nobles in check. He could plan wars and build castles with confidence, because he didn't have to guess anymore. He knew. Some villagers must have hated the survey. I mean, imagine someone showing up and counting your chickens for the king. It's not exactly heartwarming. But others might have felt a little proud, too. Being listed in the book meant you mattered enough to be counted. That your little piece of land, your tiny mill, your stubborn cow, they all became part of royal history. And over the centuries, the Doomsday Book became more than just a tax tool. It turned into a historical treasure. Historians still read it today to understand what medieval England looked like, how people lived, farmed, traded, and paid their dues. It's basically a giant medieval snapshot, frozen in ink. And the best part? It survived. Through fires, wars, and time itself, it's still around, sitting safely in the UK National Archives. Pretty good for a book that's almost 1,000 years old. The Doomsday Book also set the tone for future governments. Other rulers saw how effective it was and thought, maybe I should count my chickens too. Censuses, tax rolls, national records, they all trace a little bit of their DNA back to this moment. It's weird, isn't it? The most famous Book of Doom isn't about the end of the world. It's about cows, plows, and taxes. And here's the quiet beauty of it. When you hold the Doomsday Book, if you're lucky enough to see it, you're holding not the story of kings, but of everyday people. Farmers, millers, landholders, villagers. People who probably never imagined their grain counts would still be read centuries later. They lived, they worked, they paid, and their lives got written down in a book so dull, it became legendary. You've probably heard the phrase, counting sheep, as a way to fall asleep. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a bedtime trick. It was an actual job. Yes, real people walking around the countryside, literally counting sheep. Not for fun, not for science, but for taxes. Because in a world without banks or online forms, the easiest way to measure someone's wealth was simple. Just count their animals. Imagine you're a farmer in the year 1200. You've got a little hut, some land, a few sheep, maybe a pig that refuses to behave. Life is slow, quiet, and muddy. Then one morning you see a man on horseback coming down the road with a bag full of papers and an ink-stained hand. You know what that means. The tax collectors are back. He doesn't ask about your health or your kids or your crops. He points at your animals and says, "How many?" You tell him. Then he writes it down.
And just like that, your sheep are no longer just sheep. They're numbers in the king's book. It sounds a bit silly now, but back then, livestock was money. Every sheep meant wool. Every cow meant milk and meat. Every chicken meant eggs. And all that meant value, taxable value. So the king's men didn't just want to know how many animals you had. They wanted to know their age, their health, and even whether they were good for breeding. If your sheep were young and strong, that meant more wool later. More wool meant more taxes later. See how that works? Even your animals couldn't escape paperwork. And here's the fun part. Counting sheep wasn't easy. They don't stand still. They don't pose politely for the census. They wander. They nibble. They sneeze. They run. So the poor scribe or tax officer would stand there in a field, probably wearing way too heavy boots, trying to keep count while sheep moved around like fluffy chaos. 1, 2, 3, 4... Wait, did I already count that one? Oh no, they all look the same. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone got an accurate number at all. But sheep weren't the only thing on the list. Tax records included everything that could be counted, owned, or traded. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, donkeys, horses, bees. Yes, even bees, as well as tools, carts, grain, and fishing nets. If it existed, it could probably be taxed. There's an old saying that medieval rulers could tax the air if they could measure it, and honestly, they probably tried. Each animal had its own value. A cow might be worth more than 5 sheep. A goat might be worth less than 1 pig. And sometimes, things weren't counted in money at all. You might owe your lord 2 sacks of barley or 1 cart of firewood instead of coins. That's called a payment in kind. Basically,
I can't pay cash, but here, have some vegetables. It makes sense. Most people didn't have coins lying around, but they did have sheep and grain and milk, so that became the tax. All this information went into the records, written down by scribes who probably wished they were anywhere else. Their ledgers would list things like Osbert of the Marsh owns 8 sheep, 2 cows, and 1 rather stubborn donkey. Agnes the miller owes 1 cart of flour and 1 barrel of ale. The villagers of Stonefield must pay 12 hens per year to the manor. Not exactly thrilling reading material, but incredibly useful to the people in charge, because every name and number meant more control. And that's really what all this counting was about. Control. Kings and lords didn't care about your sheep because they liked war. They cared because every counted animal meant they knew how much wealth existed in their kingdom. That knowledge gave them power to tax fairly or not so fairly, to reward loyalty, to punish disobedience. In short, counting sheep kept the whole system running. And there's also something strangely human about it. These records show that even in a world of knights and castles, most people's lives revolved around small, simple things. A few animals, a small plot of land, maybe a garden. And yet those simple things were valuable enough to be written down in royal ink. Your sheep might never make history, but they make it into the tax ledger. And in medieval times, that was basically the same thing. Sometimes these records got surprisingly detailed. There are tax scrolls that note when animals died, when crops failed, even when bad weather ruined the harvest. That way the officials could adjust the taxes, at least in theory. In practice, though, some collectors weren't exactly generous. If you told them your sheep had all run away, they might just smile and say, well, maybe they'll come back next year. We'll still count them. So yes, medieval tax collectors had jokes too. Terrible ones. But the information they gathered helped shape big decisions. Knowing how many animals lived in each village helped rulers estimate food supplies. It helped them plan wars, trade goods, and even survive famines. The sheep on your little farm were tiny pieces of a much bigger puzzle. So when someone in 1200 counted your flock, it wasn't just about taxes. It was about the stability of the whole kingdom. Still boring, sure, but quietly important. There's a kind of beauty in it, too. These ledgers are one of the few places where ordinary medieval people are remembered. You might not find them in royal records or fancy chronicles, but their sheep, their cows, their crops, those things are written down forever. In a way, the animals became their legacy. Centuries later, historians can still see their names, their little farms, their flocks. They lived, they worked, they paid, and the records still whisper their stories. So yes, when we talk about counting sheep, most people think of trying to sleep. But for the medieval tax world, it meant something far less peaceful. It meant trudging through muddy fields, arguing with farmers, dodging stubborn goats, and hoping the ink didn't run out before sunset. It was exhausting, but it kept the gears of the kingdom turning. And maybe, just maybe, it's kind of poetic. Because all those old taxmen out there counting sheep under gray skies didn't realize they were doing something that would last for centuries. Their lists of animals became part of history. The world kept their notes, their numbers, their sheep. So next time you can't sleep and start counting sheep, think about them, the original sheep counters. They didn't do it to fall asleep. They did it to make sure their king could keep the lights on in the castle.
When they arrived, people knew. You didn't need a medieval news app to find out. Someone spotted them at the edge of the fields, and the word spread like butter on hot bread. Farmers sighed, bakers rolled their eyes, and some folks hid their best chickens behind the barn, hoping no one would notice. Because yes, hiding animals from the tax collector was a thing. People tried it all the time, and sometimes it even worked, for a while. The collector would head straight for the village center. No tea, no greetings, no hugs. just straight to business. The scribe would open the big ledger, and the collector would call out names. "Osbert of the Marsh." "Here," someone would mumble. "How many sheep?" "Still 8. "Any new lambs?" "No." The scribe would nod and scribble it down with a quill. It wasn't glamorous, but it was official, and every word written down in that book was as good as carved in stone. These routes took weeks, sometimes months. The roads were slow, muddy, and full of surprises. One day it might be peaceful fields and warm bread. The next it could be a river crossing where your horse decides, "Nope, not today." And remember, these people weren't riding on smooth highways. They had bumpy paths, uneven bridges, and sometimes no road at all. Just hope for the best paths through the woods. The collectors also had to keep track of what each village owed. Not everyone paid the same way. Some gave coins, some gave brain. Some paid in chickens, cheese, wool, or barrels of ale. Imagine writing an invoice that says 2 geese and a sack of onions. It might sound funny, but this made tax collecting a real balancing act. The collector had to make sure everything was counted, stored, or recorded so that when he returned to the manor or king's treasury, no one could accuse him of pocketing a few chickens along the way. And, oh boy, some collectors did try to pocket things. There are plenty of old complaints and court records about creative accounting, also known as stealing. A few chickens here, a couple of coins there, and suddenly the tax collector's house looks a bit fancier than everyone else's. That's why many collectors traveled with guards or assistants, not just for protection from angry villagers, but also to keep each other honest. And the villagers had their own tricks too. Some people would hide animals behind fences or in the woods. Others would swear that their pig ran away yesterday, or that the cow sadly passed. Tax collectors weren't fools, though. They knew the difference between a real accident and a creative excuse. Some would even check footprints in the mud to see if animals were really gone. Yes, medieval CSI, but for sheep. What made these routes truly important, though, was not the collecting itself. It was the recording. Every village the collector passed through was entered in the royal ledger. Every sack of grain, every goat, every single coin. When they finally returned to the manor or the king's treasury, those numbers painted a big picture of the land. How rich it was, how stable it was, and how much the ruler could spend on things like wars, feasts, or more castles. So that long, muddy ride wasn't just a boring chore, it was the backbone of medieval finance. And here's the twist. Sometimes the tax collector didn't even collect the tax right away. They'd just record what you owed, then send someone else to come get it later. Kind of like getting a medieval bill. "Dear Sir Osbert, please pay your 2 chickens and sack of barley by next Thursday. Warm regards, the Crown." Of course, if you didn't pay, they'd come back, with less warm regards. Even though their job was dull, dangerous, and muddy, tax collectors were surprisingly powerful. They had the king's authority behind them. They could fine you, report you, and sometimes even seize your stuff on the spot. Not bad for a guy with a horse and a bag of paper. And yet, despite all that, most of them were just trying to get through their route without being yelled at by angry farmers or bitten by a goose. Over time, the tax collector's route became a kind of rhythm for the villages. Just like harvest time or market days, people expected the tax collector to show up eventually. It was part of the year. Annoying, yes, but familiar. Some folks even used it as a deadline. Better finish the barn roof before the tax man comes. Or hide the good pig by Tuesday. It's funny how even the dullest routines can shape a whole society. And that's the thing. Medieval tax collection wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But those endless horse rides, scribbled notes, and muddy boots made the kingdom run. They kept castles warm, armies fed, and roads built. The collector's route was the invisible line that tied every little farm to the throne. So the next time you see a tax form and sigh, imagine that tired man in a soggy cloak, trotting down a dirt road with a sack of parchment, muttering to himself about goats and mud. Honestly, maybe clicking Submit on your online tax form isn't so bad after all. Let's be honest, paperwork isn't fun. Even today, filling out a form can feel like a boss battle. Now, imagine doing it in the year 1200. No pens that work smoothly, no soft paper, no copy-paste, no Control-Z when you make a mistake, just parchment, ink, and a whole lot of patience. If the tax collector was the muscle of the system, the scribe was the brain. This was the person who actually had to write everything down, by hand, with a quill, on expensive parchment that probably smelled like a sheep. Parchment was made from animal skin. Yep, someone scraped, stretched, and dried it until it became a smooth, well, smoothish writing surface. It was precious stuff, which meant mistakes were very bad news. You couldn't just crumple it up and grab a new sheet. Every word had to count. Imagine being a scribe at a long wooden table. The room is cold, the ink smells strong. You dip the quill into the inkwell, carefully shake off the extra drops, and slowly drag the tip across the page. One wrong move and splat! A big black blotch where 2 sheep used to be. There were no erasers, no whiteout. If you made a big mistake, you might try scraping the ink off the parchment with a little knife, but that left a scar on the page. And if you made too many mistakes, the overseer would not be happy. This is what I call high-pressure sheep accounting. Scribes had to be incredibly patient. Some of them copied entire tax ledgers by hand, line by line, number by number. Names of villagers, number of animals, how much grain was owed, who already paid, who was late, everything. And these records weren't short. Some tax rolls stretched for dozens of pages with thousands of entries. No wonder some scribes probably fell asleep at their desks. The ink they used wasn't fancy either. It was usually made from oak galls, strange little growths on oak trees. You crush those, mix them with iron salts and water, and boom, medieval black ink. It was strong stuff, so strong that some of those old tax records are still readable today, 800 years later. Your ballpoint pen wishes it could do that. But the ink also dried slowly, so every scribe had to work carefully, making sure not to smudge it with their sleeve or hand. Imagine spending 2 hours writing the perfect page and then smear. That's the kind of disaster that ruins a day.
To keep everything organized, scribes developed neat little systems. Some wrote in columns, some underlined or used symbols for different taxes, like a little sign for sheep, another for grain, another for coin. The handwriting was usually tiny, neat, and a bit curly. Medieval scribes loved fancy letters. And that means reading those old records today is basically like trying to read your doctor's handwriting, but in Latin. Speaking of Latin, most tax records weren't written in the local language. They were written in official Latin. Why? Because Latin was the language of government, church, and power. So even if you could read English, French, or German, that didn't mean you could understand the tax book. It was basically written in bureaucrat code. If you didn't speak the language of power, you needed someone else to explain what your taxes even were. That gave the scribes even more power. They were gatekeepers of knowledge and
let's be honest, they probably felt a little important about it. Now here's where things got extra fun. If the collector and scribe were out on the road, they had to write in the field. Picture a scribe sitting on a wobbly wooden stool in a cold barn, trying to keep his parchment flat while chickens peck at his boots. The ink freezes, the wind blows, the quill bends, and some goat sneezes on the ledger. But still, the work must go on, because taxes wait for no one. Back at the manor or royal treasury, though, things were a bit more organized. There were scriptoriums, basically writing rooms, where scribes copied and stored records carefully. Shelves full of scrolls, wooden chests packed with ledgers, and the smell of ink everywhere. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the engine room of medieval government. Without these people quietly scratching away with their quills, the king wouldn't have a clue how much money or grain he actually had. Because here's the thing. Tax money didn't just float magically to the castle. Every coin and every chicken had to be counted, recorded, and stored. These records told the ruler how rich the kingdom was, how many soldiers they could afford, or whether they could throw another big feast without running out of bread. In a way, the scribes were like the hard drives of the medieval world. Silent, dependable, and kind of underappreciated. But don't imagine every page was perfect and beautiful. Scribes were human. Some got tired, some got sloppy, some added little doodles in the margins when they were bored. Yes, there are real tax rolls with tiny drawings of faces, animals, or random squiggles. I guess after counting sheep all day, even serious scribes needed to let loose a little. The most famous example of this kind of record-keeping is the Domesday Book, a giant survey ordered by William the Conqueror in 1086. It wasn't just a list of taxes, it was a snapshot of the entire country, who owned what, how much land they had, and how much it was worth. All written carefully, page after page, by scribes who probably had sore hands and bad eyesight by the end. The Domesday Book has survived for centuries. Why? Because parchment lasts, ink lasts, boring tax records also last. It's kind of beautiful in a weird way. All those long nights in cold rooms, all those careful letters on animal skin, they created something permanent. Scribes didn't wear crowns or ride horses into battle, but without them, no kingdom could function. Every sheep counted, every coin noted, every grain measured. All of it passed through their ink-stained fingers. So, the next time you're tired of typing your name into an online form for the 10th time, imagine being that medieval scribe, sitting at a table, scratching away on goat skin with no spell check, no undo button, and ink that smudges if you breathe too hard. Suddenly, digital paperwork doesn't sound so bad, does it? So far, we've talked a lot about counting sheep, scribbling in ink, and riding muddy roads. But let's be real, all that counting wasn't just for fun. Medieval rulers weren't collecting chickens and coins so they could frame them and hang them on the wall. They wanted castles. Big, stone, expensive castles. And guess who paid for those castles? Yep, sheep, chickens, grain, and people like you. Well, medieval you. Castles didn't come cheap. Building one was like taking on the world's most ambitious home improvement project. First, you needed stone. A lot of stone. Then you needed masons, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks to feed the workers, and someone to yell at everyone else to work faster. All of that cost money. And in the Middle Ages, the king or lord didn't have a magic ATM. The money came from taxes. Imagine you're living in a small village. You're minding your own business, trying to keep your cow from escaping again. Then the royal messenger rides in and announces that the lord is building a new castle on the hill. Sounds cool, right? A big castle nearby. Maybe it'll have fancy towers. But then comes the second announcement. To help with the construction,
everyone will contribute. Translation: congratulations, your taxes just went up. Taxes didn't always mean handing over coins. You might have to bring cartloads of stone or spend part of your year working on the construction site. In some places, people were required to do corvée labor, basically free work for the Lord as part of their tax. So while the Lord sat around imagining how tall the tower would be, ordinary villagers were hauling rocks through the mud. But the result, well, it was impressive. Castles rose slowly like stone giants. Thick walls, tall towers, big gates, designed to say one thing: power. Every time you walked past it with your basket of eggs, you were reminded who ruled this land. And, fun fact, your eggs probably helped pay for that gate. The clever part about this system was how organized it was. All the materials and labor were carefully recorded in the tax rolls. If your village gave 10 wagon loads of timber, someone wrote it down. If your neighbor spent 3 weeks carving stones, that went in the record too. It was like a very old-fashioned construction budget, but with more mud and fewer spreadsheets. And let's not forget the garrisons. Once the castle was built, someone had to live in it, and guard it, and feed everyone. That meant soldiers, servants, blacksmiths, bakers, a whole mini economy, which of course meant more taxes to keep it running. A castle wasn't just a building. It was a government building, a fortress, and a symbol of royal strength all in one.
Of course, the villagers didn't exactly get a say in the matter. When the king wanted a castle, it happened, even if the villagers were tired, even if they didn't have enough wagons, even if their sheep had other plans. That's one of the big differences between then and now. Back then, taxes weren't something you could debate. They were more like gravity. They just were. But here's the fascinating thing. Some of those castles are still standing today. The stones that people hauled through the mud 800 years ago are still sitting proudly on hillsides. The towers still cast long shadows. So in a weird way, the villagers' taxes became a kind of time machine. They built something that outlived them, something that tourists now pay to take selfies in front of. Of course, not all tax money went into stone and towers. Some went into feasts, wars, or shiny new armor, but castles were the big, visible symbol of it all. If a lord collected a lot of taxes, he didn't just want a bigger purse. He wanted a bigger castle than the guy down the river. Medieval rulers had a bit of a mine is bigger competition going on. And when castles grew, so did the tax system. New walls meant new scribes to record everything. New soldiers meant more payments to manage. New villagers moving in meant more sheep to count. The castle and the tax rolls grew hand in hand, like two vines twisting around the same tree. Boring? Yes, but effective. Every stone in a castle has a story. A villager who carried it, a scribe who recorded it, a cart that creaked under its weight. It wasn't built by magic, it was built by everyday people who paid their taxes, often with tired hands and muddy boots. That's the not-so-glamorous side of those fairy tale towers. Behind every romantic castle view, there's a long list of tax records somewhere. And maybe that's what makes them kind of amazing. Most of those villages didn't have their names written in history books, but their work, their taxes, their chickens, they are history. They built something that lasted. A sheep here, a sack of grain there, a few days of hard labor. Stone by stone, tower by tower. So next time you see a medieval castle, try to look past the towers and flags. Think of the scribes hunched over their ledgers, the farmers rolling their eyes as they hand over their best pig, the carts bumping down the road with heavy rocks. That castle isn't just a monument to kings and lords, it's a monument to taxes. Up to this point, we've been treating medieval tax records like these neat, honest little lists of sheep, coins and grain, numbers carefully written by hard-working scribes, collected by muddy, tired taxmen on horses. Neat, orderly, reliable. Except they weren't always honest. You see, sometimes those records didn't tell the truth. Sometimes they lied. And sometimes they lied a lot. Now, let's be clear. A parchment can't lie by itself, but the people holding the quill, oh yes, they definitely could. Medieval tax records were supposed to be the official voice of the kingdom. They told the king how rich his lands were. They told lords how much their people owed. They were basically the medieval version of a financial report. But if someone tweaked the numbers even a little, it could change everything. One of the most common creative adjustments came from the villagers themselves. When the tax collector rode into town, not everyone was eager to share their full list of treasures. If you had 10 sheep, maybe you only admitted to having 6. If you had 3 pigs, maybe you suddenly had just 1 left. Poor thing. A little lie here, a little active innocence there, and your taxes dropped. Of course, collectors weren't dumb. They'd seen every trick in the medieval playbook. Some would do surprise inspections. Some counted footprints. Some just had a good nose for lies and pigs. But the villagers weren't the only ones playing the game. Sometimes the collectors themselves bent the truth. Why? Simple. Money. If a collector said the village owed 100 coins, but reported only 80 to the lord, guess where the missing 20 went? Right into someone's pocket. It was risky, sure, but it happened a lot. And since not every village had someone who could read or write, it was easy to make numbers disappear between the barn and the castle. Then there were the scribes, the people with the quills and ink. Most of them were honest, tired, and just trying to get through another long day of writing about sheep. But a few figured out they could do more than write down the truth. They could shape it. If a scribe erased a name, changed a number, or accidentally left out a line, entire tax amounts could shift. One tiny ink mark could mean the difference between a lord's feast or a very awkward royal budget meeting. And then, oh yes, there were the lords themselves. Some of them played the game on a much bigger level. Let's say a powerful lord wanted to look poor. Why? To avoid paying too much to the king. All they had to do was order their scribes to underreport their wealth. Suddenly, the king's fancy castle-building plans had a few missing zeros. Other lords did the opposite. They over-reported wealth, not because they loved taxes, no one does, but because it made them look powerful. The richer their land seemed, the more respect they got in court. It's amazing how much can change when a few numbers are adjusted. This is why modern historians have a love-hate relationship with medieval tax records. On one hand, they're gold mines of information: names, wealth, crops, population. On the other hand, well, sometimes they're basically medieval fan fiction. There are records of entire villages that disappeared on parchment, but definitely existed in real life. There are people listed as poor who were actually rich, and people listed as rich who were, well, living with 1 chicken and a dream. Some of the most dramatic lies came during times of war or famine. When things got bad, people tried harder to avoid taxes. Collectors tried harder to look busy but bring in less trouble. And scribes, well, some probably just gave up trying to make sense of it all. Imagine a scribe staring at a muddy list of names while everyone in the village swears they lost their sheep in a storm. It's not hard to see how a few numbers might get smudged, conveniently. Of course, not all lies were sneaky. Some were just mistakes.
When everything is written by hand, in freezing barns with goats bleating in your ear, it's easy to miscount. 6 sheep might look like 8. 1 card of barley might become 2. And Agnes might be recorded as Agatha, because, honestly, the scribe was probably tired. So even honest records could be a little fuzzy around the edges. Over time, some rulers realized this lying business was a problem. So they started sending out inspectors, basically the medieval version of auditors. These were tough, serious people with sharp eyes and sharper questions. They'd visit villages after the tax collectors and compare what people said they had with what the records claimed they had. If they found a lie, let's just say you didn't want to be on the wrong side of the inspector's ink.
The truth is, medieval tax records were always a little bit flexible. They reflected real wealth, yes, but they also reflected fear, greed, mistakes, and good old human creativity. And honestly, that's what makes them weirdly fascinating. A perfectly accurate tax roll would be boring. A slightly crooked one, that tells a story. Think of it like this. Behind every 8 sheep on the page might be a farmer who actually had 10, a collector who kept 2 for himself, and a scribe who was too tired to care. Behind every 2 barrels of grain might be a lie, a deal, or a very clever chicken smuggler. Every line of ink has fingerprints on it. Not literal ones, hopefully, but human ones. Real people, with all their flaws and schemes, shaped those records. And that's why historians today treat these tax rolls like witnesses in a mystery story. They're helpful, but you don't believe every word they say. You question them. You compare them. You look for the sheep that went missing between the fields and the castle gate. Because medieval history isn't just about swords and crowns. It's also about math that didn't quite add up. In a funny way, all those lies, mistakes, and clever tricks make the records more human. They remind us that people back then weren't so different from people now. Nobody likes paying taxes. And if there's a way to make the bill smaller, well, some people will try. So yes, the tax rolls lied, but those lies built a richer, messier, more real picture of the past. Not just what people owned, but how they thought, how they acted, and how they sometimes tried to sneak a sheep past the king. After all that talk about taxes, tithes, and tricky scribes, you might be wondering, was there anything fun about medieval finances? Surprisingly, yes. It turns out that even tax records sometimes tell stories of celebration, community, and, of course, missing paperwork. Medieval life wasn't all mud and misery. Villages had markets, festivals, and grand feasts. And guess who wrote down all the spending and earnings from those? Yep, the same tired scribes who were recording how many sheep everyone had. These records might seem boring, but they actually capture some of the happiest moments of medieval life. When a fair came to town, everyone, from bakers to blacksmiths, paid little fees for stalls, space, and even the right to sell their pies. And all those tiny payments, they went into the tax rolls. So while the records are full of numbers, they also secretly tell us, hey, there was a fair here once, and it smelled like roasted meat and ale. The fairs were huge events. For many people, it was the only time of year they saw traders from faraway places. Imagine a quiet medieval town suddenly bursting with color, noise, and strange accents. Merchants selling spices, fabrics, jewelry, and things most villagers had never even seen before. And in the middle of all this fun, a man with a quill and parchment, writing it all down. Because wherever there was money changing hands, someone was there to tax it. Feasts were no different. Whenever a lord hosted a big celebration, maybe after a good harvest or a royal visit, it showed up in the financial books. Not because anyone wanted to remember the menu, but because someone had to pay for it. So you'll find records that read something like 4 barrels of ale, 2 pigs, 40 loaves of bread, 1 fiddler. It's basically a medieval shopping list for a party. And let's be honest, the best part of these records are the weird details. Sometimes the scribe added little notes like, paid extra for candles after sundown, or wine spilled by servant.
These tiny scribbles are like little time machines, giving us glimpses into moments that weren't meant to be remembered. We don't get the full story, just the receipt. But that's enough to imagine the laughter, the smells, and the sound of someone trying to play music on a slightly broken lute. Of course, not every feast was fun for everyone. For the peasants, these parties could mean more work or more taxes. If a lord threw a big event, someone had to pay for all that meat and mead. And if the treasury was running low, guess who got invited to contribute? That's right, the villagers. Sometimes the tax rolls show sudden donations from nearby farms right before a big feast. Donations that definitely weren't voluntary. Because in the medieval world, supporting your lord often meant giving up your best chicken. But even with all that, the feasts were important. They brought people together, broke up the dull rhythm of daily life, and for a night or two, made everyone forget about taxes. In a funny way, the same records that list who owed what also capture moments of joy and generosity. After a successful harvest, villages would sometimes pay a little extra tax voluntarily to fund a communal meal. It was their way of saying, "We survived another year, let's eat." And historians can spot those moments, the sudden bump in spending on ale or candles, like little fireworks hidden in the parchment. Then there were the forgotten receipts, my favorite part, because medieval record-keeping was, let's say, creative. Sometimes people forgot to record what they spent. Sometimes they recorded things twice. And sometimes they lost the receipts entirely. There are ledgers with mysterious notes like 2 shillings missing, reason unknown, or payment for the goose not yet found. You can almost hear the sigh of the poor clerk trying to make sense of it all. There's even evidence that some collectors, realizing they'd lost money or records, would just make something up. It's like the medieval version of, yeah, I totally turned that in. And honestly, can you blame them? If you've been riding through rain for days, carrying sacks of coins and muddy paper, a missing receipt is probably the least of your worries. Still, for modern historians, those forgotten receipts are gold, because they show the human side of all this bookkeeping, the mistakes, the improvisation, the little oops moments that make the past feel real. Now, fairs also brought another kind of excitement, temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity. Fairs also brought another kind of excitement, temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity. Fairs also brought another kind of excitement, temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity. Fairs also brought another kind of excitement, temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity. Fairs also brought another kind of excitement: temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity. Fairs also brought another kind of excitement: temporary taxes. Whenever a big event happened, the local lord or the king could issue a market tax, basically a short-term fee for anyone selling or buying stuff. It helped raise money fast and kept things under control. So in tax records, you might see entries like 3 pence from the cheese seller, 6 pence from the pot maker, and sometimes fine from the man who fought near the ale tent. Yes, even fights got recorded, because if there was damage to property, someone had to pay for it, and that someone's name ended up in the tax book for eternity.
Fairs were also where a lot of gossip happened, both social and financial. Collectors used fairs to catch up on who had money, who didn't, and who suddenly had a suspiciously large number of new sheep. So fairs weren't just about fun. They were also unofficial update meetings for the tax world. As for feasts, some were so big they actually became annual taxes themselves. If a lord threw a legendary celebration one year, next year he might say, "Let's do that again." But now everyone contributes a little every harvest. Boom! A tradition was born. And once something became a tradition in the Middle Ages, it was basically forever. But maybe the most charming part of all is how tax records turned these fleeting, joyful events into permanent memories. A party might last one night, a fair maybe a week, but the ink lasted centuries. And now, hundreds of years later, we can still find evidence of people laughing, eating, and celebrating, all because someone wrote down, "paid 2 pence for bread and music." So, while most medieval tax rolls are serious business, numbers, debts, fines, every now and then they smile. Hidden among the lists of sheep and coins are traces of laughter, spilled wine, and very tired musicians. Even in the world of taxes, life found a way to party. For most of this story, our scribes have been sitting quietly in the background. Just humble folks with ink-stained fingers, writing down numbers no one but the king and a few accountants cared about. But here's the twist. Scribes weren't just silent bystanders. Sometimes they pushed back. Sometimes they fought back. And no, not with swords or pitchforks. Their weapon was much sharper: the pen. Being a medieval scribe was not glamorous. You didn't get shiny armor. You didn't get songs sung about you. You just got a hard chair, bad lighting, and a mountain of dusty parchment to copy. They worked long hours in cold rooms with stiff quills and ink that smelled suspiciously like old boots. And if you made a mistake, you couldn't just hit backspace. You had to scrape the ink off the parchment with a little knife, carefully, so the king's tax totals didn't end up looking like 17 sheep and a panic attack. Most scribes were stuck recording the same thing over and over. 2 pigs, 3 sacks of grain, 1 very annoyed peasant. Day after day, year after year. So after a while, some of them decided, quietly, to make their own fun. You can actually find little doodles in the margins of medieval tax records. Tiny drawings of animals, little faces, sometimes rude jokes.
Once in a while, someone even drew a knight fighting a snail. We're still not sure why, but it's legendary. These doodles didn't change the taxes, but they were the scribes' way of saying, hey, we're here too. But doodles were just the beginning. Some scribes took things a step further. They started adding tiny comments in the margins, snarky little notes about what they were writing down. For example, imagine copying the same name 20 times. At some point, a scribe might scribble, "This man again," or "Why does he have so many pigs?" It's like the medieval version of whispering under your breath at work. These tiny human moments are some of the most delightful discoveries for historians, because it means behind every number, there was a person rolling their eyes. And then, sometimes, scribes had power, real power. Why? Because they controlled the records. A scribe could make your taxes look a little higher or a little lower. They could accidentally misplace a document. They could add a note that changed how much a village owed. Oh, now that was dangerous. Some scribes became trusted allies of powerful nobles. They were the quiet ones in the corner of the room, but their ink could shape kingdoms. A clever change to a number here, a careful omission there, and suddenly someone owed less or someone else was in debt. In a world where most people couldn't read, a scribe's pen was basically magic. But scribes didn't only meddle for power. Sometimes they pushed back just to survive. If the tax collectors were rude or lazy, scribes might make their jobs harder. Maybe a line was, accidentally, too smudged to read, or a column of numbers just didn't quite add up. Oops! And if the lords were cruel or the workload impossible, scribes might band together and resist in subtle ways. Slow writing, late records, or conveniently losing a stack of papers. It wasn't a revolution, it was gentle rebellion, the kind that leaves no blood, just very confused tax collectors. One of the most famous cases of scribal pushback comes from England in the 14th century. A group of overworked clerks started delaying the king's tax documents, not out of treason, but because they were exhausted and underpaid. When questioned, they didn't deny it. They basically said, look, if you want perfect records, stop paying us in stale bread. This small act forced the crown to actually improve scribes' conditions, a rare win for the people holding the quills. And here's something fun. Some scribes left secret messages for future readers. Hidden between lines or tucked in margins, they'd write things like, "This job is boring," or "If anyone reads this, please send help." Okay, maybe not literally send help, but pretty close. They knew no one in their time would care, but maybe someone, centuries later, would find their little note. And we did. And honestly, it makes them feel a little less like dusty history and more like real, tired humans, just like us. Not all scribes were quiet rebels. Some actually rose in rank. Because they controlled knowledge and numbers, a skilled scribe could get promoted, become a trusted advisor, or even manage estates. There were scribes who started out copying sheep counts and ended up sitting next to lords at fancy tables. Quill power, baby! But even then, many never forgot where they came from. And their writing often shows little flashes of personality, wry comments, clever abbreviations, or tiny drawings that made the margins of history more colorful. By the late medieval period, scribes became essential to how taxes worked. Without them, nothing got written down. No one could prove how much was owed, who paid what, or which chicken went missing. So while kings and lords strutted around with swords and crowns, the scribes sat quietly at their desks, making the whole system run, like unsung background characters in a very slow, very bureaucratic play. Modern historians owe a lot to those scribes. Without their ink, we'd know almost nothing about how medieval economies actually worked. Their neat handwriting and their occasional sarcasm built the skeleton of history. And their quiet pushbacks, those remind us that even the dullest jobs have moments of rebellion. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear ink. So the next time you think of medieval tax records, don't just picture dusty scrolls and grumpy lords. Picture a tired scribe, squinting at a candle, doodling a tiny snail knight in the corner, and muttering, "Another pig? Really?" Because in their quiet, ink-covered way, the scribes struck back. For all the effort kings, lords, and scribes put into keeping those medieval tax records neat and organized, the truth is, life didn't always cooperate, because sometimes history literally hit the books. And when it did, it hit hard.
You see, the Middle Ages were full of things that didn't care about paperwork. Floods, fires, plagues, wars, rats, you name it. To a pile of parchment, all of those were the stuff of nightmares. Imagine spending weeks carefully writing down every sheep, every coin, and every bucket of grain, only for a candle to tip over, and whoosh, there goes half the kingdom's accounting system. It happened more than you'd think. Let's start with fire, the great enemy of parchment. Medieval buildings were mostly made of wood, and candles were the main source of light. So fire was not just possible, it was practically guaranteed at some point. Monasteries, royal treasuries, and town halls all went up in flames at various times, taking records with them. A single spark could erase decades of tax history. One historian once called this the medieval delete button. Except, unlike a keyboard, you couldn't undo it. Then came floods. Most medieval towns were built near rivers. Great for trade, terrible for archives. When rivers overflowed, the lower floors of record halls often turned into soggy soup. Parchment doesn't like water. Wet ink smudges, pages stick together, and soon your careful list of cows looks more like an abstract painting. Some clerks tried to dry the pages by hanging them near fires, which, you guessed it, sometimes caused another fire. Medieval problem-solving at its finest. And if water and fire weren't enough, along came rats and mold. Paper and parchment were basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for rodents. There are surviving records with tiny chew marks, whole corners missing, and even suspicious little footprints. It's oddly adorable until you realize the rats just ate the evidence that your village ever paid its taxes. As for mold, that was the slow, silent destroyer. Damp storage rooms turned perfect ink into fuzzy, unreadable blobs. Centuries later, historians found some pages that looked like they'd been sneezed on by a swamp monster. But the biggest disaster, the one that truly shattered the ledgers, was the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-13th century, it didn't just kill millions of people. It also wiped out the people keeping the records. Tax collectors, clerks, and scribes died or fled. Entire offices shut down. In some places, tax collection stopped completely for years, not because people refused to pay, but because there was no one left to collect. When the dust settled and the survivors tried to restart the system, they discovered chaos. Half the taxpayers were gone. Villages had vanished. And old debts didn't make sense anymore because the debtors, well, were no longer among the living. It was the ultimate accounting nightmare. In fact, many of the tax records we have today show strange gaps right around plague years. Suddenly, numbers drop, lists get shorter, and sometimes, instead of names, the scribes just wrote things like "village deserted" or "all gone." It's haunting, a reminder that behind every missing number was a real person lost to history. War was another record killer. Armies didn't care where archives were stored. If they needed the space, or if the building looked useful for firewood,
in went the torch. In the 100 Years' War, for example, many English and French local records were burned or looted. Sometimes, rival lords even stole each other's tax rolls, partly to cause chaos and partly to erase their own debts. That's right. Medieval identity theft was basically steal the ledger and pretend you never owed anyone anything. And then there were the quieter disasters, the ones that didn't make headlines, like ink shortages. When wars or bad harvests cut trade routes, ink ingredients became scarce. Monks had to stretch what they had, sometimes mixing in odd things like soot or wine. So yes, there are actual medieval documents written in what might be part ink and part leftover red wine. Those pages are still faintly purple to this day. History, aged like, well, Merlot. Sometimes the disasters weren't physical at all. They were bureaucratic. Maybe the king died, and the new one decided to change the entire tax system. Or a scribe got promoted and took the old records home for safekeeping, only for them to vanish into his attic forever. Or a lord lost his documents in a family feud. Basically, medieval paperwork could die from neglect just as easily as from fire. Yet, despite all of this, the burning, the flooding, the mold, the rats, the plague, some records did survive, and that's kind of amazing. Think about it. Hundreds of years later, we still have ledgers that tell us exactly how many cows a village had in 1322. That means someone, somewhere, cared enough to copy, protect, and hide those dusty rolls through all the chaos. There are even stories of monks grabbing tax scrolls before fleeing fires, clutching them like precious relics. To them, those weren't just numbers. They were proof of stability, of life continuing even when everything else fell apart. Today, historians treasure those fragile survivors. Every smudge, burn mark, or rat bite tells its own story. A piece of parchment that looks ruined to us might be a miracle to them, because it somehow made it through centuries of disasters to land in our hands. In the end, the story of medieval tax records isn't just about numbers and coins. It's also about survival, of paper, of memory, and of human stubbornness. People back then faced flood, fire, and plague, but still believed it mattered to write things down. And maybe that's the heart of it. Even in the dullest corners of history, someone cared enough to keep track, because to them, recording the world, even the boring parts, was a way to fight forgetting. So next time you see an ancient, half-burned parchment in a museum, don't just see a ruin. See a survivor. A tiny piece of history that refused to be erased, no matter what disasters came its way. Every once in a while, medieval kings liked to remind everyone who was in charge. Sure, they already had shiny crowns, fancy robes, and armies with pointy spears, but real power wasn't about the sword. It was about the ledger. And nothing sent a shiver through a medieval lord's spine when the word said, "The king is doing an audit." Now, when we hear audit today, we might picture accountants with calculators, spreadsheets, and bad fluorescent lighting. But in medieval times, an audit was a royal event. It was a mix between a serious investigation and a traveling circus of paperwork. A royal audit meant that the king, or more realistically, his officials, would travel around the kingdom digging through tax records to make sure everyone had paid what they owed. And if they hadn't, oh, they were in trouble. Step 1. Send the auditors. Royal auditors were usually stern men in plain robes with excellent handwriting and very little sense of humor. They'd arrive in a town or manor with stacks of blank parchment seals and a general air of, "Don't mess with us." Villagers and local lords would scramble to bring out their records, rolls of parchment that had been stored in chests or under beds or sometimes behind chicken coops.
And these auditors didn't just take a quick look. They combed through everything. If a record said 10 cows, they wanted to see the cows. If it said a tax was paid in grain, they'd go sniff the granary. Nothing escaped the royal nose.
Step 2. Compare the numbers. The auditors carried their own master copy, the king's official record. If your numbers didn't match his numbers, congratulations, you just got yourself a royal headache. Sometimes the difference was just a mistake. Maybe the scribe had miscounted. Maybe a cow wandered off. Maybe the ink smudged. But other times, it was suspicious. That's when the auditors leaned in, very slowly, and asked questions in that calm, terrifying way only tax officials can. And yes, people tried to cheat the system. Some hid extra sheep in the woods. Some forgot to record new barns. Some bribed scribes to quietly adjust the numbers. But here's the thing. Kings loved money, and they were surprisingly good at sniffing out missing coins. A single missing ox could lead to a full-blown investigation. And if you were caught, the punishment wasn't just a slap on the wrist. You could lose land, you could lose your job, and in some really bad cases, you could lose more than that. Medieval tax fraud was no joke. Step 3, punish or reward. When the audit was over, the king's men made their report. If you'd paid everything fairly, congratulations, you got to keep your land and maybe even earned a royal pat on the head. But if they found gaps, mistakes, or forgotten payments, well, let's just say you'd wish you'd counted your chickens better. Sometimes the king just demanded extra taxes as a fine. Other times, he seized property. And if the culprit was a lord, the fallout could be very political. Audits weren't just about money. They were also a way for the king to keep nobles in check. A smart king could use a tax audit like a sword, cutting down any noble who got too powerful. But it wasn't all fear and punishment. Audits could also be strangely theatrical. Royal auditors often arrived with banners, trumpets, and guards to make their authority loud and clear. Imagine someone showing up to check your homework with a marching band. Crowds would gather to watch the proceedings, whispering and pointing at whichever unlucky lord was sweating through his robe. And because everything was written on parchment, there was always a lot of waiting while scribes copied, double-checked, and triple-checked numbers. Audits could last weeks. It was medieval bureaucracy at its most dramatic. Once the audit was done, the scribes carefully copied their findings into neat rolls and sent them to the royal treasury. These records were like little time capsules. They didn't just list taxes, they listed everything. Cows, pigs, sheep, loaves of bread, barrels of ale, fishing nets, spinning wheels, carts, buckets, spoons, anything that could be taxed was. That's why modern historians love these audit records. They give us a surprisingly detailed picture of everyday medieval life, down to how many chickens someone owned in 1365. It's not exactly glamorous, but it's real. Sometimes, though, the king himself would show up. Not always, of course. Kings had battles to fight, feasts to attend, and crowns to polish. But when a king did appear at an audit, it was a big deal. People would kneel, trumpets would sound, scribes would panic and suddenly write extra carefully. And the king would sit on a fancy chair, nodding like he understood every single number, even if he secretly didn't. For the people being audited, that was peak stress. Because how do you explain a missing pig to the guy wearing the crown? What's funny is, for all their drama, these royal audits actually worked. They pulled in money, scared the nobles a little, and kept the kingdom's finances from falling apart. They were boring, painfully boring, but they were powerful. And behind every big medieval project, from castles to cathedrals to wars, there was usually a stack of freshly audited tax records making it all possible. Sometimes these audits even became part of royal legend. Kings bragged about them in their chronicles. Nobles complained about them in letters.
Peasants mostly just grumbled quietly. But whether loved or hated, everyone knew when the king's audit came to town, nothing was hidden for long. Today, those royal audit rolls survive in archives and libraries. They're brown, fragile, and written in looping, spidery handwriting. But they're still loud in their own quiet way. They tell us who paid, who lied, who tried to get away with a missing sheep. And most of all, they remind us that even in the dullest corners of history, someone was watching the numbers. So, next time your modern tax office sends you a reminder, just be thankful there isn't a royal trumpet outside your door. Medieval audits were a show, and no matter how sleepy they sound, they shaped kingdoms in ways few people today ever notice. When you think about medieval history, you probably imagine knights, castles, and maybe a dragon or two. But you know who really left their mark on history? The taxman. Yep, the guy with ink-stained fingers, counting sheep and scribbling numbers in dusty rooms. He may not sound heroic, but without him, the Middle Ages would have been a financial mess, even more than it already was. Let's be honest, nobody liked the medieval taxman. If he showed up at your village, you'd suddenly remember a dozen chores that needed doing somewhere else. He was the bearer of bad news. The king needs more money. Again. But here's the thing. Those scribes, collectors, and accountants shaped the way governments worked for centuries. Their boring, repetitive, please pay your taxes routines slowly built the foundations of modern record-keeping. In other words, the taxman walked so spreadsheets could run. The earliest medieval tax collectors weren't trained accountants. They were usually local officials, sometimes priests or merchants who were good with numbers, or at least better than the guy who thought 2 goats made a dozen. They didn't have calculators or ledgers with neat columns, just parchment, ink, and a lot of patience. But over time, tax collecting became a specialized job. Whole departments formed just to manage records, track payments, and organize royal income. It was the birth of bureaucracy, that slow, paper-filled monster we all know and tolerate. And while nobody threw parades for these early tax workers, they quietly changed the way governments ran. Before them, rulers depended on memory and promises. After them, everything was written down. And that made a huge difference. If you had records, you had proof. Proof of who owned what, who paid what, and who owed the king a favor. That meant less arguments, well, slightly fewer, and more stability. You couldn't just claim, "Oh, I'd already paid last year." The ledger would say otherwise. Some of those records even became famous. The Doomsday Book, for example, that massive survey ordered by England's William the Conqueror in 1086, was basically one giant tax document. It listed every person, animal, and scrap of land in the kingdom. Imagine a national census, but everyone's main concern is how much you owe the king. That book was so detailed and so permanent that people joked it would last until Judgment Day, hence the name Doomsday. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Almost 1,000 years later, it's still here, sitting quietly in the British archives.
All thanks to a bunch of medieval tax nerds with good handwriting. The methods they developed, keeping written records, using standard measurements, double-checking entries, didn't stay in the Middle Ages. They spread across Europe and eventually became the backbone of modern government. Kings, popes, and city councils all copied the system. They realized that if you wanted power, you needed data. It wasn't about swords or castles anymore. It was about ledgers. And those ledgers did more than track money. They accidentally preserved history. Every tax roll, every dusty parchment is a tiny time machine. It tells us who lived where, what they owned, what they grew, even what they named their calves. Without those records, we'd know almost nothing about how ordinary people lived. Because let's be honest, medieval chronicles talk a lot about kings and battles, but not much about farmers and bakers. The tax records filled in those gaps. They're like the medieval version of a social media feed, just with fewer selfies and more sheep. Over the centuries, the taxman became more official. In some places, tax offices grew so large they were practically mini kingdoms of their own. Whole families worked in them for generations. Clerks trained apprentices, auditors became powerful advisors, and royal treasurers started influencing big political decisions. At one point, the person managing the taxes often knew more about the kingdom than the king himself. He had the numbers, and numbers meant control. There's an old saying, "He who keeps the books keeps the power." And in medieval Europe, that was absolutely true. But there was also a strange sort of pride in the job. Many scribes saw themselves as servants of order in a chaotic world. Every name, every coin recorded was a small victory against confusion. They didn't ride into battle or slay dragons, but they kept the realm running. Quietly, invisibly, and endlessly. Their legacy isn't in monuments or songs, but in organization. And maybe that's the most underrated form of heroism there is. As the centuries rolled on, the tax systems they built evolved. They became more structured, more detailed, more paperworky. By the Renaissance, royal treasuries were basically early versions of ministries of finance. By the 18th century, governments had entire departments dedicated to taxes, audits, and budgets. And all of it started with those early, boring medieval ledgers, scratched out in candlelight by tired scribes trying not to spill ink on their sleeves. And even today, historians still study those ancient tax rolls. They use them to trace climate changes, migration patterns, and social trends. It's wild to think that a record meant to track sheep could end up teaching us about centuries of human history. The taxman didn't just shape the economy, he accidentally became one of history's best storytellers. So next time you file your taxes or complain about forms, just remember, you're part of a tradition nearly 1,000 years old. The tools changed, but the principle didn't. Write it down, keep it safe, make sure it adds up. That's the legacy of the medieval taxman. Quiet, dull, and utterly essential. And maybe, just maybe, the world needs a few more boring heroes like that. Because in the end, history isn't just written by warriors and kings. It's written by people who kept the receipts.